In summer 1944, the ancient Polish city of Sandomierz became the focal point of one of World War II's most decisive operations. Located on the banks of the Vistula River, this strategic crossing point would witness the Red Army's breakthrough into German-occupied Poland and establish the springboard for the final assault on Nazi Germany itself. The Sandomierz Offensive represented far more than a tactical victory. As Soviet forces prepared to cross the Vistula and establish bridgeheads on Polish soil, they stood poised to deliver the death blow to Hitler's crumbling Eastern Empire. The operation would demonstrate the Red Army's evolution into an unstoppable war machine capable of complex multi-front operations across vast distances. Sandomierz's strategic importance lay in its position controlling vital river crossings and transportation networks connecting southern Poland to East Prussia and Germany proper. The city's medieval fortress, perched on high bluffs overlooking the Vistula, had commanded this strategic bottleneck for centuries. Whoever controlled Sandomierz could threaten German communications and open multiple axes of advance toward Berlin. The German occupation of this region had begun in September 1939 during the invasion of Poland that triggered World War II. Wehrmacht forces, supported by SS units, established harsh occupation policies designed to eliminate Polish culture and intelligentsia. The local population faced systematic persecution, forced labor, and deportation to concentration camps throughout 5 years of brutal Nazi rule. Under German control, Sandomierz became a fortified strongpoint anchoring the eastern approaches to the Reich. Army Group North Ukraine, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model, had spent months constructing defensive lines designed to halt Soviet advances. The Vistula River provided a natural barrier that German commanders believed could be held indefinitely with proper fortification and adequate reserves. By July 1944, the strategic situation had fundamentally shifted in favor of the Soviet Union. Following the successful destruction of German Army Group Center during Operation Bagration, Red Army forces stood poised to continue their westward advance. The Wehrmacht, reeling from catastrophic defeats across multiple fronts, struggled to maintain coherent defensive lines against overwhelming Soviet pressure. Marshal Ivan Konev commanded the 1st Ukrainian Front, the massive formation assembled to conduct the Sandomierz operation. His forces included over 843,000 troops, supported by 13,000 artillery pieces, 2,200 tanks, and 2,800 aircraft. This concentration represented one of the largest military formations in history, demonstrating Soviet industrial capacity and organizational sophistication achieved through years of warfare. German defenses protecting the Sandomierz sector were extensive but increasingly undermanned. The 4th Panzer Army, led by General Fritz Hubert Grazer, held fortified positions along the Vistula with a mixture of veteran Wehrmacht divisions and hastily assembled Volkssturm units. However, German forces were outnumbered nearly 4-1 and lacked the reserves necessary to contain major Soviet breakthroughs. The German defensive strategy relied heavily on natural obstacles provided by the Vistula River and its marshy approaches. Extensive minefields, anti-tank barriers, and carefully positioned artillery created interlocking fields of fire designed to channel Soviet attacks into predetermined killing zones. German engineers had fortified key positions throughout the region, transforming towns and villages into fortress complexes. Soviet planning for the Sandomierz offensive demonstrated the sophisticated combined arms doctrine the Red Army had perfected through 3 years of continuous warfare. Rather than launch predictable frontal assaults, Konev designed a complex multi-axis operation that would overwhelm German defenses through simultaneous attacks at multiple points along the front. The key to Soviet success lay in achieving rapid breakthroughs that would allow tank armies to exploit deep into German rear areas before defenders could organize coherent resistance. Soviet doctrine emphasized speed and concentration of force at decisive points, supported by overwhelming artillery preparations and close air support from increasingly dominant Red Air Force units. Preparations for the offensive required enormous logistical efforts conducted under strict operational security. Soviet engineers stockpiled bridging equipment, ammunition, and fuel in forward positions while maintaining strict camouflage discipline. Artillery units registered their guns on German positions, while tank crews prepared for rapid advances once breakthrough operations succeeded. Intelligence gathering played a crucial role in Soviet planning, with reconnaissance units conducting detailed surveys of German defensive positions. Partisan groups operating behind German lines provided valuable information about troop dispositions and supply routes. This intelligence network allowed Soviet commanders to identify weak points suitable for concentrated attacks. On July 13, 1944, the Sandomierz offensive began with a devastating artillery bombardment that shattered German defensive positions across a 150-kilometer front. Over 6,000 guns opened fire simultaneously, delivering concentrated firepower that exceeded anything previously seen on the Eastern Front. The bombardment continued for hours, systematically destroying bunkers, communication systems, and artillery positions. Under cover of the artillery barrage, assault troops from the 3rd Guards and 13th Armies began their attacks against stunned German defenders. Soviet infantry, supported by tanks and self-propelled artillery, advanced methodically through shattered German lines. The combination of overwhelming firepower and tactical sophistication proved irresistible against demoralized German forces. The breakthrough was swift and devastating. Within 24 hours, Soviet forces had penetrated German defenses to depths of 15 to 20 kilometers, creating gaps that German reserves could not close. The 1st Guards Tank Army, commanded by Colonel General Mikhail Kartukov, exploited these breakthroughs and advanced rapidly toward the Vistula River crossing sites. German response was hampered by the destruction of communication networks and the confusion created by simultaneous attacks across multiple sectors. Field Marshal Model recognized the threat immediately but lacked sufficient mobile reserves to contain all the Soviet penetrations. German counterattacks were launched piecemeal and achieved no decisive results against overwhelming Soviet superiority. By July 15, Soviet forces had reached the Vistula River and begun establishing bridgeheads on the western bank. The 38th Army successfully crossed near Sandomierz, while the 60th Army forced crossings at multiple points upstream. German attempts to destroy bridges and ferries were largely unsuccessful as Soviet engineers worked continuously to maintain crossing sites. Soviet river crossing operations demonstrated the technical expertise Red Army engineers had developed through years of offensive warfare. Pontoon bridges were constructed under fire, while amphibious vehicles ferried troops and equipment across the swollen river. These complex operations required precise coordination between multiple arms and services operating under combat conditions. The fighting for Sandomierz itself was fierce but brief as German defenders, threatened with encirclement, conducted a fighting withdrawal toward prepared positions further west. The 6th Guards Tank Corps reached the city outskirts on July 17, while infantry units cleared remaining German strongpoints. Soviet forces raised their flag over Sandomierz' ancient fortress on July 18. Street fighting in Sandomierz was limited by rapid German withdrawal, but Soviet forces still faced determined resistance from brigade units. German paratroopers and SS troops established defensive positions in key buildings and attempted to deny Soviet forces use of the city's transportation infrastructure. These delaying actions bought time for German forces to establish new defensive lines west of the river. The establishment of the Sandomierz bridgehead marked a crucial turning point in the Eastern Front campaign. Soviet forces had successfully breached the Vistula barrier and established a secure foothold on German-occupied Polish territory. The bridgehead provided staging areas for future operations and demonstrated that natural barriers alone could not halt Red Army advances. Expansion of the bridgehead continued throughout late July as Soviet reinforcements poured across the Vistula. The 1st Guards Tank Army advanced westward, capturing Tarnobrzeg and threatening German communications throughout southern Poland. German counterattacks, including desperate assaults by the 16th Panzer Division, failed to eliminate the expanding Soviet presence. The human cost of the Sandomierz operation reflected both its importance and the intensity of the fighting. Soviet casualties totaled approximately 67,000 killed and wounded, while German losses exceeded 45,000. These figures demonstrated the continued lethality of Eastern Front warfare even as German resistance weakened throughout the region. The strategic consequences of the Sandomierz offensive were immediate and far-reaching. German Army Group North Ukraine found its entire defensive line compromised, forcing a general withdrawal toward the Carpathian Mountains and Slovakia. The Soviet bridgehead threatened German communications and provided multiple options for future offensive operations. For the Soviet Union, the successful Vistula crossing provided enormous strategic and psychological benefits. The Red Army had demonstrated its ability to conduct large-scale river crossing operations against defended positions, validating years of tactical development and training. Soviet forces now stood on the doorstep of the German homeland itself. The political implications extended throughout German-occupied Europe as Nazi allies recognized the inevitability of German defeat. Romanian and Hungarian leaders began secret negotiations for separate peace agreements, while resistance movements throughout Eastern Europe intensified their activities against increasingly isolated German garrisons. International reaction to the Soviet success was overwhelmingly positive among the Allied powers. American and British observers noted the sophisticated planning and execution displayed by Red Army forces, recognizing that the Eastern Front had become the decisive theater of the European war. The victory strengthened coordination between Allied forces preparing for final operations. German propaganda attempted to minimize the significance of the Soviet breakthrough, claiming that defensive lines remained intact and that counteroffensives were being prepared. However, neutral observers recognized that the loss of the Vistula barrier marked another step in Germany's inevitable retreat from conquered territories. Individual acts of heroism during the offensive became legendary in Soviet military tradition. Guards Captain Alexander Matrosov led his company in the assault crossing at Sandomierz, personally eliminating German machine gun positions that threatened the bridgehead. Despite severe wounds sustained during the fighting, he continued commanding his unit until the position was secured. Senior Lieutenant Nina Onilova commanded a mortar battery that provided crucial fire support during the river crossing operations. Her accurate fire eliminated German strongpoints that were holding up the advance, enabling infantry units to establish footholds on the western bank. Her unit's actions exemplified the professional competence Red Army forces had achieved. Soviet engineering units performed remarkable achievements during the operation, constructing multiple bridges under enemy fire and maintaining supply lines across the contested river. Colonel Pavel Yushchenko's engineer regiment built 5 separate crossings in 72 hours, enabling continuous reinforcement of bridgehead forces despite German artillery and air attacks. The civilian population of the Sandomierz region faced enormous challenges during the offensive as fighting swept through their communities. Many Polish residents, weakened by years of occupation and persecution, welcomed Soviet forces as liberators while others remained suspicious of new occupiers. The complex political situation required careful handling by Soviet administrators. Polish partisan groups operating in the region provided valuable assistance to advancing Soviet forces, conducting sabotage operations against German communications and supply lines. These resistance fighters had maintained organized opposition to German occupation throughout the war and possessed detailed knowledge of local terrain and enemy positions. The technological aspects of the offensive demonstrated continued Soviet military innovation and adaptation. Improved coordination between different arms enabled more effective combined operations, while new artillery techniques provided devastating fire support. Soviet aviation achieved complete air superiority, providing close support that proved decisive in breakthrough operations. Medical services faced significant challenges treating casualties from the intense fighting and river crossing operations. Soviet medical units had developed efficient evacuation and treatment procedures that minimized casualties and returned wounded soldiers to duty quickly. German medical personnel, many captured during the retreat, provided assistance treating injured from both sides. The destruction caused by the offensive was extensive but focused primarily on military targets and transportation infrastructure. German forces, pressed by rapid Soviet advances, implemented scorched earth policies that destroyed bridges, railways, and industrial facilities. However, many civilian structures survived intact due to the speed of the Red Army advance. Weather conditions during July and August 1944 generally favored Soviet operations, with clear skies enabling maximum use of aviation and mechanized forces. Occasional summer thunderstorms created temporary difficulties for river crossing operations but did not significantly impact the overall success of the offensive campaign. Supply and logistics challenges were enormous given the scale of forces involved and the rapid pace of operations. Soviet quartermasters had developed efficient systems for maintaining supply lines across contested territory, utilizing both traditional methods and innovative solutions adapted to battlefield conditions. The successful logistical support enabled sustained offensive operations over extended distances. Post-offensive consolidation in the Sandomierz region required immediate Soviet attention to establish stable administrative control and prepare for future operations. The bridgehead became a major supply hub and staging area for subsequent advances toward Germany. Soviet authorities worked to restore civilian infrastructure while maintaining military readiness. The political implications of Soviet presence in Poland created complex challenges that extended far beyond military considerations. Relations between Soviet forces and Polish resistance groups became increasingly strained as competing visions for post-war Poland emerged. These tensions would influence political developments throughout Eastern Europe in subsequent years. Soviet intelligence services immediately established operations in liberated areas to maintain security and gather information about German defensive preparations further west. The NKVD conducted investigations into civilian behavior during occupation while also working to identify and eliminate potential threats to Soviet control. The reconstruction of transportation networks and communication systems became priorities for Soviet engineers working to consolidate gains and prepare for continued advances. Within weeks of the offensive's completion, railway lines and major roads had been restored to operational status, enabling the movement of supplies and reinforcements. The Sandomierz Offensive marked a decisive moment in World War II, demonstrating Soviet capability for large-scale offensive operations and establishing the foundation for final assaults on Nazi Germany. The successful crossing of the Vistula validated years of military development and provided momentum for continued advances toward Berlin. The operation became a symbol of inevitable Allied victory and the approaching collapse of Hitler's Thousand-Year Reich.